Did Islam abolish slavery, or did Islam allow it? You may think you already know the answer, but here's the uncomfortable truth. Islam did not abolish slavery overnight. Slavery continued in Muslim societies for centuries. So here's the question that nobody can escape. If Islam is a religion of justice, why didn't the Quran simply say slavery is forbidden? And if Islam really encouraged freedom, why did Muslim empires continue to own slaves? We're going to examine the Quran, the words of Prophet Muhammad, the classical Islamic laws, and what Muslims actually did throughout history. And I promise you one thing, I'm not going to hide the uncomfortable parts, because if we're looking for the truth, we have to be willing to follow it even when it hurts. And by the end, you'll understand why the simple answer, Islam ended slavery, or Islam supported slavery, is not enough to explain the real history. Before we judge what Islam changed, we have to understand what already existed. Because here's the first uncomfortable fact. Islam did not invent slavery. Human beings had been enslaving other human beings long before the Quran was revealed. Rome had slavery. The Byzantine world had slavery. The Persian world had slavery. And Arabia had systems of captivity, servitude, and enslavement. But we need to be careful. You will sometimes hear people say that pre-Islamic Arabia was completely built on slavery. That's too simplistic. The historical evidence does not allow us to make such an exaggerated claim. But slavery itself was real. People could be captured. People could be bought and sold. And people could become enslaved through warfare and other circumstances. Then Islam appeared, and this is where the story becomes much more interesting. Islam entered a world where slavery was already an established institution. But instead of simply ignoring it, Islamic revelation began regulating it. The Quran repeatedly connected the freeing of enslaved people with righteousness and religious responsibility. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught Muslims to treat enslaved people with dignity and to avoid burdening them beyond their ability. But now comes the difficult question. If Islam was pushing people toward freedom, why didn't it simply abolish slavery immediately? Why regulate an institution instead of declaring it completely forbidden? That question is going to take us much deeper, because in the next part, we're going directly into the Quran, not internet arguments, not propaganda, not what critics claim, not what defenders wish the text said. We're going to look at the actual verses and ask one simple question. Was Islam protecting slavery? Or was it creating a path toward its disappearance? And that's where the real debate begins. Now we come to the most important question. What does the Quran actually say about slavery? Not what critics say, not what defenders say. What does the Quran itself say? The Quran does not simply state, slavery is completely forbidden, but it repeatedly places the freeing of enslaved people among acts of righteousness, repentance, and religious responsibility. In Surah Al-Balad, Allah describes the difficult path of righteousness, and one of the first acts mentioned is freeing a slave. And that's not all. In several legal situations, emancipation is part of an expiation. Quran YP includes freeing a believing slave for accidental killing. Quran 5-89 includes freeing a slave for certain broken oaths. And Quran 58:3 also prescribes emancipation as an expiation. So why does the Quran repeatedly connect religious responsibility with freeing slaves? But here's the difficult question. If freeing slaves is so important, why didn't Allah simply say, slavery is forbidden? That's a serious question, and we're not going to avoid it. Quran 24:33 tells believers to make emancipation contracts with enslaved people who seek them, when appropriate, and forbids forcing enslaved women into prostitution. The Prophet Muhammad also emphasized humane treatment. In Sahih al-Bukhari, he described enslaved people under an owner's authority as brothers, commanding owners to feed and clothe them properly and not burden them beyond their ability. So Islam entered a world where slavery was already deeply established. It did not abolish the institution with one explicit prohibition. Instead, it regulated it, repeatedly encouraged emancipation, and imposed moral duties toward enslaved people. But we must be honest. Classical Islamic law continued to recognize slavery as a legal institution, and Muslim societies practiced slavery for centuries. So we face an uncomfortable tension. A religion repeatedly encouraging freedom, while Muslim societies continued slavery. Was this a gradual strategy? A limitation of the historical context? Was classical Islamic law morally incomplete? Or is there another explanation? That's the question we'll examine next. Because in Part 4, we're going into the issue that makes the slavery debate much harder: war captives. Now we have reached the part that many people avoid, because if we are going to be honest about Islamic history, we cannot stop at verses about freeing slaves. We have to talk about war captives. Imagine a battle has ended. People are dead. The defeated army has surrendered, and now there are prisoners. What happens to them? This is where the Quran gives us something extremely important. In Surah Muhammad, verse 4, after describing prisoners taken in battle, the Quran says that they can be released afterward, either as a favor or in exchange for ransom. Think about that. The Quran is directly discussing what happens to prisoners after battle, and one of the options it gives is freedom. But here's the uncomfortable part. Classical Islamic law did not simply say that every prisoner must automatically be released. Historically, jurists recognized several possible outcomes for captives, and enslavement was among the options recognized in the classical legal tradition. So now we have a serious tension. The Quran says, release them or ransom them. But classical Islamic law also developed rules concerning enslavement. So what exactly happened? This is where history becomes much more complicated than a simple slogan, because Islamic law was developed over centuries by different scholars and legal schools, and those scholars were dealing with a world where slavery was already an international institution. They were not writing modern human rights law. They were developing a legal system inside the political and military realities of their own time. But does that settle the moral question? No. It creates an even bigger one, because what about the women and children captured during war? This is where the historical sources become extremely uncomfortable. Sahih Muslim contains reports concerning female captives taken at the Battle of Hunain and the application of Quran 4:24 to captive women. So we cannot honestly make a video about Islamic slavery while pretending this evidence does not exist. But we also have to understand exactly what the sources are saying. We cannot replace history with emotion, and we cannot replace history with excuses. The question is, what did the classical Islamic system actually permit? And what did it forbid? And most importantly, what did freedom look like for someone who had already been captured? Because this is where the next chapter becomes even more difficult. We are going to talk about something that modern audiences find extremely disturbing: female captives, concubinage, and sexual relations with enslaved women. And this time, we are not going to hide behind vague words. We are going directly to the primary sources, because if we want people to trust this documentary, we have to be willing to show them the parts that are hardest to explain, and that is exactly where we are going next. Now we have to go somewhere uncomfortable, because if we're serious about Islamic history, we have to discuss female captives. This is one of the strongest criticisms people raise against Islam, and honestly, it deserves a serious answer, not a joke, an insult, or "you just hate Islam." The classical sources really do discuss sexual relations with enslaved, captive women. The Quran refers to those whom your right hands possess, and Sahih Muslim contains a narration concerning female captives taken at the Battle of Hunain. The companions were concerned because some of these women had husbands among the enemy, and the narration connects this situation with Quran 4:24. So yes, this is part of the Islamic sources. We should not pretend otherwise. But what exactly did this mean in the classical legal system? Was every captive woman automatically available to every man? No. Classical Islamic law established rules concerning ownership, distribution, waiting periods, lineage, gene age, and who could have sexual relations with whom. But we also have to be honest about the difficult part. She was still an enslaved woman. She had not entered that situation as a free woman choosing her circumstances. That is precisely why modern people find this morally disturbing, and that discomfort is a serious question. The classical legal framework did not treat an enslaved woman as legally identical to a free wife. That is a historical fact. So we have to ask the deeper question: why did classical Islamic law regulate slavery instead of immediately abolishing it? Was the goal gradual emancipation? Was slavery deeply embedded in the ancient international system? Was captivity understood as a consequence of warfare? Or does this reveal a genuine moral limitation in the historical legal tradition? These questions cannot be answered with one sentence. The Quran also presents release and ransom as options for prisoners of war in Quran 47:4, while classical jurists recognized enslavement as one possible outcome for captives. And here we reach the central tension. The Quran contains pathways toward freedom. Classical law still recognized slavery. Muslim societies continued practicing it. Centuries later, Muslim scholars increasingly debated whether the moral trajectory of Islam required complete abolition. So don't leave yet, because the next question is even bigger. If slavery was really meant to disappear, why did it survive for more than 1,000 years? To answer that, we have to go far beyond Arabia to Africa, the Middle East, the Indian Ocean, and the Ottoman world. That's where the history becomes darker, deeper, and much more complicated. You might think the hardest part of this story is over. It isn't, because now we leave the pages of legal books and enter the real world. Africa, the Middle East, the Indian Ocean, the Ottoman Empire. And this is where we have to confront something uncomfortable. Muslim societies did not simply discuss slavery. They built economies and political systems around it. Historical research shows that slavery became economically, socially, and politically important in many African Muslim societies. From the Sahara to the Nile Valley, from the East African coast to West Africa, enslaved people were bought, sold, transported, and forced to work. Take the Sokoto Caliphate in West Africa, an Islamic state founded in the early 19th century. Historians describe it as one of the largest slaveholding societies in the world. Enslaved people worked on farms and in households. Some became soldiers or administrators. Some women became concubines. Others were transported toward North Africa. This is not a story we can simply erase. And it forces us to ask a brutal question. How could societies governed by Islamic law become so dependent on slavery? The uncomfortable reality is that religion does not automatically make human beings righteous. People can know religious teachings and still choose power, money, status, or convenience. But we must also avoid turning history into a simple story of one race versus another. African societies were diverse. Some participated in slave raiding. Some resisted it. Some people were enslaved by Muslim rulers. Others were enslaved by non-Muslim rulers. And some enslaved people eventually became powerful themselves. The history was complicated, but complicated does not mean harmless. For the person who was captured, separated from family, transported hundreds or thousands of kilometers, and forced into slavery, political complexity did not erase the suffering. Some escaped. Some resisted. Some fought for freedom. Some left written testimonies. And their stories remind us of something important. A slave was not simply a number in a historical statistic. Behind every number was a human being, a mother, a father, a child, a person with a name, a family, a language, a home, and a life before captivity. That is why this documentary cannot become a celebration of empire. It has to remain a search for truth. But now comes the biggest question. If slavery became deeply connected to Muslim economies and political systems, how did it finally begin to disappear? Did Muslim scholars lead abolition? Did governments change the law? Did ordinary Muslims demand freedom? Did European pressure force Muslim rulers to change? Or was it a mixture of all of these? Because the next chapter takes us into the 19th century when the old system began to collapse, and one of the most powerful Muslim empires on earth, the Ottoman Empire, was forced to confront slavery in a completely new world. For centuries, slavery had existed inside Muslim societies. Then, the 19th century arrived, and the world began to change. European powers were expanding. New ideas about citizenship and human rights were spreading. International pressure against the slave trade was growing. Muslim rulers were forced to face a difficult question. Can slavery continue in a changing world? The Ottoman Empire is an important example. The Ottomans had used enslaved people for centuries, but during the 19th century, the government increasingly faced pressure to restrict the slave trade. Abolition did not happen through one single event. Laws changed. Treaties were signed. Markets were restricted. Slave trading networks were attacked. And religious and political arguments evolved. But there was resistance. Why? Because slavery was not only a religious issue, it was also connected to money, labor, military power, households, and social status. When powerful people benefit from an institution, abolishing it is rarely simple. Across Muslim-majority societies, abolition happened at different times and under different circumstances. Tunisia became an important early example. In 1846, Ahmed Bey abolished slavery in Tunisia. This matters because it shows that abolition was not simply imposed by colonial governments. Muslim rulers themselves could take abolitionist action, but European diplomatic pressure also mattered. International anti-slavery campaigns mattered. Economic changes mattered. And local Muslim reformers mattered. So which one caused abolition? The honest answer is, there wasn't one single cause. History rarely works that neatly. As abolition spread, Muslim scholars had to reconsider an old legal question. If classical Islamic law had recognized slavery, could a Muslim ruler permanently prohibit it? Could public interest justify ending an institution that classical jurists had once recognized? These questions contributed to major changes in modern Islamic thought. Some scholars defended the classical framework. Others argued that the historical conditions that produced slavery no longer existed, and that Muslims should recognize its abolition. Eventually, abolition became the dominant position across the modern Muslim world. But now we face the hardest question. If slavery is considered unacceptable today, what does that tell us about the classical legal tradition? Does modern abolition prove that Islam was always secretly abolitionist? Or does it show that Muslims eventually changed an old legal system because the world had changed? That's uncomfortable for everyone, and that's exactly why we have to ask it. Can a religion's moral trajectory develop through history, even when its followers once accepted an institution that later became morally unacceptable? And once we answer that question, did Islam end slavery? But this time, we'll have the entire history in front of us. We've traveled through more than 1,000 years of history. We've looked at the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, classical Islamic law, Muslim empires, Africa, and the Ottoman world. And now we have to put everything together. Because here's the question. Was slavery actually part of Islam, or was it something Muslims inherited from the ancient world? The answer is not simple. Let's separate the pieces. First, the Quran did not create slavery. Slavery already existed. Second, the Quran did not immediately abolish slavery. That's also true. Third, the Quran repeatedly encouraged emancipation and made freeing slaves an act of righteousness and expiation. Fourth, classical Islamic law recognized slavery as a legal institution. And fifth, Muslim societies practiced slavery for centuries. So what do we do with all of this? Here's where many debates collapse. Someone says, Muslims had slaves, therefore Islam commands slavery. But that conclusion doesn't automatically follow. Muslims can disobey their own religion. A Muslim can steal, but Islam forbids theft. A Muslim can murder, but Islam forbids murder. A Muslim ruler can become corrupt, but Islam condemns corruption. So historical behavior cannot automatically tell us what Islam teaches. But there's another mistake. Someone might say, Islam encouraged freeing slaves. Therefore, Islam completely abolished slavery from the beginning. That also doesn't fit the historical evidence. Slavery continued. Classical jurists recognized it. Muslim governments practiced it. And enslaved people suffered. So we must resist both extremes. The serious question is not, was every Muslim good? And it isn't. Was every Muslim evil? The question is, what did the sources actually establish, and how did Muslims interpret and apply them over time? Islamic law developed through different scholars, schools, regions, political circumstances, and historical periods. That means there was debate and disagreement. Then the modern world began challenging slavery more aggressively. Muslim scholars had to confront the old legal tradition with a new moral and political reality. Some defended the classical position. Others argued that abolition was compatible with Islam, and today the mainstream Muslim position is clear. Slavery is not an acceptable institution to revive. But what happened to the old legal rulings? Were they reinterpreted? Were they suspended because the conditions that supported them disappeared? And most importantly, what does Islam actually say about human dignity and freedom? Our final chapter goes back to where this story started. Not to an empire, not to a battlefield, not to a slave market, but to the Quran. And this time we'll ask the question from the opposite direction. What kind of society was Islam actually trying to build? And that answer may be the most important part of this entire documentary. The Quran speaks about human dignity, justice, charity, and freeing enslaved people. Surah al-Balad places freeing a slave on the difficult path requiring sacrifice for another human being. Look at Bilal ibn Rabah. He had been enslaved and tortured because of his faith. After his emancipation, he did not become a second-class Muslim. He became one of the Prophet Muhammad's famous companions and called believers to prayer. His story reminds us that human worth is not determined by social status. Slave, free, Arab, non-Arab, rich, poor. Your value before Allah is not determined by society's labels, but we must remain honest. Islamic ideals did not magically eliminate injustice. Muslims were human beings. They could obey Islamic teachings or betray them. History contains both. We should never use the worst actions of Muslims to define what Islam teaches, but we should also never use Islamic ideals to erase the suffering caused by Muslims. Both truths can exist at the same time. Islam entered a world where slavery was already deeply established. It did not abolish the institution immediately. It regulated the existing system, encouraged emancipation, and made freeing enslaved people an important moral and religious act. Yet Muslim societies continued slavery for centuries. Eventually, abolition came through a complicated combination of religious interpretation, political reform, economic change, and international pressure. So, did Islam abolish slavery immediately? No. Did Muslim societies practice slavery? Yes. Did Islamic teachings encourage emancipation and humane treatment? Yes. Can Islamic history be understood through only one of these facts? No, history is bigger than a slogan. Truth is bigger than a debate. You can acknowledge the suffering of enslaved people and the failures of Muslim societies while still examining what the Quran and the Prophet actually taught. Real faith does not require rewriting history. Real history does not require hating a religion. We can face the truth without fear. Don't defend people simply because they were Muslim. Don't condemn a religion simply because some followers failed to live up to it. Study the sources. Study the history. Separate the two. Then make your judgment. Because if something is true, it should survive an honest investigation, and truth does not need us to hide history. If you found this documentary helpful, subscribe to the Lights of Islam for more honest conversations about Islam, history, and difficult questions. Thank you for watching.